The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, your AML automation software for faster onboarding, smarter monitoring, and growth without overhead.
We have never seen funds laundered as rapidly as they were laundered in the first 72 hours after the Bybit hack. We saw the entire amount of Ethereum stolen, converted to Bitcoin within the first 72 hours.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance, and financial crime to the real world. Are you ready to step into a parallel world, a funhouse mirror version of our financial system? It's a bizarre world where no money moves, but currency changes hands between criminals, state-backed hackers, and drug cartels. It's one of the biggest threats in financial crime today, and yet remains massively under-researched and misunderstood. I'm your host, Marit, CEO of Strise, and in this episode, we are revealing the secrets of shadow banking. We will be discussing the size and scale of shadow banking today, the consequences of this parallel financial system, and what can we do to shut it down. To dive into this topic, I'm here with Ari Redbord, Global Head of Policy, TRM Labs. Before joining TRM Labs, he was a senior advisor at the United States Treasury, working with teams from OFAC and FinCEN to combat illicit finance and protect against terrorist financiers and other rogue actors. He also served for over a decade as an assistant United States attorney, prosecuting cases related to terrorism, espionage, and cryptocurrency. Welcome to The Laundry. It's a pleasure to have you.
It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me today.
What has been your career highlight to date?
You know, I've been very lucky to have a bunch. You know, as you mentioned, I spent about 11 years as a federal prosecutor, and getting to walk into courtrooms every day and say Ari Redbord for the United States, and trying to represent the country and our citizens it was a huge highlight. Getting to work with teams across the U.S. Treasury Department to stop illicit actors from taking advantage of the financial system. But I have to say, the last 5 years building at TRM has been just a true honor. We started out about 5 years ago. We were 7 or 8 people. Today we're over 400, really across the world. And working with federal, state, local law enforcement and regulators to build a safer crypto financial system has been the honor of a lifetime.
Thank you for the introduction. Let's dive into the discussion about shadow banking today, because it is a topic that we have mentioned in several episodes of The Laundry. So I'm super excited to actually go down into the rabbit hole and understand it a bit more. So let's just start by looking at the size and scale of shadow banking today, and just start with, how would you define shadow banking in a super simple, easy to understand definition, short for our listeners?
All right, let me give this a shot. So Chinese underground banking networks, what we're calling shadow banking here, or mirror banking, they serve as a financial lifeline for criminals worldwide. They are informal banking channels that operate outside traditional banking regulations to move value across borders. One thing that's important to mention, and everything we're talking about today, these have existed forever. They were often operated through traditional bank accounts and shell companies, but we've seen innovation over the last couple of years because cryptocurrency has enabled cross-border value transfer at the speed of the internet. So think underground banking channels, many of which are in China, but these things are also global.
So you can imagine that it is like a bank, but not operating with a banking license and offering, traditional banking products, but tailored to criminals who need to move money around.
That's exactly right.
And you're saying it is predominantly Chinese who are operating these shadow banking.
This is obviously happening at scale, involving Chinese entities, but it's also happening worldwide. I don't think there's probably any jurisdiction where some version of shadow banking or underground economic transactions is not occurring.
Do you know anything more about the people behind these shadow banking operations?
It's very diverse. Again, we see on the ground brokers in every jurisdiction now. The dominant international players are definitely Chinese, though we see brokers offering cash to crypto services around the world, even in the United States. One thing that I think is really important, a couple months ago, and I think this is probably the genesis of this, or how you found your way to us, we wrote a report on shadow banking. And one thing that we were a little bit surprised about at TRM is the way that basically the major threats that we're thinking about when it comes to crypto, we're talking about pig butchering scams, right? Fraud. We're talking about drug cartels. We're talking about North Korea cyber actors. We started to realize that all roads led to these shadow banking organizations. And Mexican cartels, for example, have increasingly relied on Chinese brokers, as do North Korea hackers. So all roads lead to these money laundering organizations, and that's something that's become more and more clear. But I think I don't think it is right to necessarily put sort of any stereotype on exactly who's behind these things because it is so diverse.
In the report you mentioned, you talk about cross-border payments being made without a wire transfer ever happening. Like, how does shadow banking work? How are these drug cartels able to launder and transfer such huge amounts of money?
Let me try this as an example because we actually try to come up with ways to think about it as I'm describing this. So let me just give you an example, right? You have a cartel that has United States dollars, right, from drug proceeds that it wants to essentially repatriate. A Chinese broker, one of these networks, takes that cash and remits it to the cartel as USDT or some type of stablecoin, cryptocurrency.
So the shadow banking, they accept cash.
That's correct.
But what do they do with the cash afterwards? Like, someone still needs to deal with the cash at some point.
Absolutely. So that is the next step, essentially, in this process. That the USDT that I mentioned, the stablecoin, is sourced often directly from pig butchering and other types of crypto-centric scams. So you're raising funds through this type of scam activity.
Could you explain to our listeners what pig butchering scams are? Because I don't think everyone knows this. So that is a term I don't think people know.
Absolutely. And a really important one. Probably folks are familiar with this, right? We're getting these text messages on our cell phones almost daily. I sometimes get them every hour. And it basically is the beginning of a conversation from someone you don't know on the other end. And oftentimes they will result in a romantic relationship, maybe in a business relationship. But over time, that the scammer on the other end will say, hey, I've gotten a lot of money recently. And we'll talk about a crypto investment that they've made, getting the victim to send them funds to invest. And over time, the victim will send more and more funds, fattening up the pig, for lack of a better description, and ultimately will steal those funds. We're seeing people lose billions of dollars globally. I'd say since 2023, we've seen about 50 billion in scams and fraud in the crypto ecosystem. Much of that is this type of pig butchering that I'm talking about. And that number is woefully underreported by as much as 85%. So we're talking about $50 billion, magnitudes more than that in losses. People are losing their life savings. So when I talk about pig butchering scams, it's a terrible term, but it definitely, I think, resonates with the severity of what's happening out there. Oftentimes you hear them as investment scams or romance scams. And it's oftentimes a combination of a bunch of different things. But there are vast networks in Southeast Asia, in particular, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, that are involved in these scams. There are even scam camps where people are being human trafficked to act as the scammers. There's a great UN report on this. U.S. government has taken action. The UK government has taken action in the form of sanctions against some of these networks. But happy to kind of dig into this further.
You use the term pig butchering, but it is the large-scale organized fraud centers, in a sense, that often involves crypto in some shape or form.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so back to the how the shadow banking works. So one, you have a cartel or someone with a lot of cash who wants to get into the digital world somehow. So they give the cash over to these shadow banks who then do what?
They then remit that cash to the cartel as USDT or some other cryptocurrency, a stable coin usually. And a stable coin is a digital asset that is pegged to a stable asset. 90+% of stable coins are pegged to the US dollar. So you've heard about USDT, you've heard about USDC. These are stable coins. Ultimately, and those are stable coins in this situation, cryptocurrencies that are sourced from these types of pig butchering operations. Then to your question initially, the Chinese brokers then launder that cash through domestic US bank accounts. oftentimes the money is made available to Chinese nationals who want to access US dollars for a number of different reasons, to buy real estate, to pay expensive tuition for their kids in school in the US. That's when that's when the brokers in China take domestic wire in yuan and then release the US dollars via their associates.
So then you have a cash transaction happening in the US and the wire transactioning happening in China. So it's like completely decoupled and it's impossible to kind of tie those two together.
That is correct.
Strise turns AML from a costly burden into an automated winner. But don't just take my word for it. Let's hear what Norway's own BN Bank has to say.
BN Bank specializes on mortgages and the real estate industry, a high-risk industry when it comes to money laundering. Before, we wasted 10 to 15% of our resources investigating false flaggings from legacy systems. Obviously, something had to change. We decided to implement Strise because we saw that there were flaws in the legacy system that we have. The money launderers easily identify which banks they are able to do their transactions in and where they're not subject to enhanced customer due diligence. And without the help of Strise, we would have ended up harboring a lot of new clients and celebrating the new clients whilst increasing the risk in the bank. With Strise, you are able to turn on automation in onboarding of low-risk clients, but more important than that, you can use Strise to classify clients better and with that reduce unnecessary flagging. False flagging is when you get the transaction flagged that after investigation is not linked to money laundering. And when we get the reduction in false flagging by 30%, like Strise has enabled, we are able to reallocate 10 to 15% of our combined resources into further investigation of high-risk clients.
Explore the AML Automation Cloud. Visit strise.ai for more information. All right, so cartels or whoever collects a lot of cash, they hand them over to the shadow banks who then give them stable coins. And then they release all this cash or make it available to Chinese citizens who have some sort of business they want to do in the US, who then pay the shadow banks in a bank transfer in the local currency in China.
Very, very well said. And then the cartel can use the cryptocurrency to pay debts. Chinese goods sellers, where they're talking about fentanyl, can take USDT and trade for yuan with Chinese brokers. This whole system operates organically without central direction. The real customer at the end of the day are Chinese nationals seeking access to USD, right? Seeking access to the US dollar. And they pay steep commissions for that access. The US dollar is the product, and those that supply it are essentially the cartels in this situation.
Is there ever a point in time where kind of the shadow banking world and the traditional banking world ever cross paths?
There certainly are. We see large Chinese banks, other global banks that become part of this system because they're either knowingly or most of the time not knowingly providing banking services ultimately to some of the people who are part of this system, whether they're the Chinese nationals in the US, whether they're US persons, and really across the world.
But one of the things, I mean, if I needed a mortgage or a bank account, it's easy to find a normal bank. But how do one find a shadow bank? Where do these businesses advertise themselves? How do they get new customers in, and how do they sustain this as a business?
It's a really great question. And oftentimes, in this world, if you're engaged in this type of activity, you're part of these networks. Many of these networks are run by organized crime. The triads famously in China have been part of the underground banking system for years. If you're in illicit drug trade or other types of trade, you're very familiar with these types of actors.
So it's like referrals and word of mouth that keeps these businesses sustained in a sense.
That is the nature of all business. And certainly it's true here.
How big is the business of shadow banking? Like what market size are we talking about here?
Getting bigger and bigger, and it's really hard to put a number on this for all the reasons you could possibly imagine. And I'm certainly not in a position to do that here. But I would say that like what we're seeing from a liquidity standpoint is that these organizations seem to be getting bigger and having access to more and more liquidity. Let me give you a quick example on that. And we can go into as much detail on this as you want. In February of this year, we saw North Korea attack the cryptocurrency exchange Bybit and steal about $1.5 billion in proceeds. At TRM, we worked with government, we worked with Bybit to trace and track those funds to ultimately seize them back for governments, for investors. We have never seen funds laundered as rapidly as they were laundered in the first 72 hours after the Bybit hack. And what that said to us is that these networks that are being used to launder the funds must have much more liquidity than they've ever had before. We saw the entire amount of Ethereum stolen, converted to Bitcoin within the first 72 hours after the hack. So we're seeing deep expertise in cryptocurrency, but we're also seeing enough liquidity to essentially make that happen.
Yeah, also, super interesting you bring up this example, because I also read that one of the kind of impressive sides of that hack was how fast the money got out. I guess it was from TRM Labs that I read it, that like how well planned it had to be. It's not something you just do, you stumble upon and you do this hack. It was like so flawlessly executed on the kind of off-ramp to get the money out in cash.
Well, this will be the follow-up podcast because we can do an entire other discussion on North Korea cyber actors, North Korea threat actors, and the way they've attacked the crypto ecosystem. I mean, 2025 has already been a record year, in large part driven by the Bybit hack, but we've seen well over 2 billion stolen by North Korea just this year. They have been attacking the crypto ecosystem for years now, but they've gotten better and better at the laundering. One really, really important point to make whenever we're talking about North Korea is that they're different than normal hackers, right? At the end of the day, if we're able to track and trace these funds, if we're able to disrupt some of these shadow banking networks and the way they're moving funds, that's just the cost of doing business for North Korea. They're not worried about getting caught. No one's going to jail, right? These people are unreachable in North Korea, possibly in China. But the reality is they are now able to steal and launder larger and larger amounts of funds.
So the shadow banking profession and the business and the industry is becoming more and more professionalized, is kind of the conclusion.
It is. Like, we have a partnership with Thon and Tether that we call T3, which is a financial crime unit where we investigate cases involving Tether on Thon. The number one crime that T3 has investigated and seized funds from is money laundering as a service. Professional money laundering organizations, not North Korea hacks, not pig butchering scams, not ransomware, not child sexual abuse materials or darknet markets, but money laundering as a service. This has become very, very professionalized through these networks.
Oh, wow. So The Laundry is a podcast for compliance professionals, first and foremost. So while we talk about these things like shadow banking, it can seem a bit like, hidden away on the internet. It's the dark web, cryptocurrency, all of that. But if you work as a compliance AML or AML professional in a normal bank today, what are some of the red flags that you should be on the lookout for to kind of detect if your bank is being used as a part of shadow banking?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really important question. And a lot of them are the same red flags for other types of money laundering activity. Are we seeing large amounts of cash involved? Are we seeing, people maybe that you don't have a long-term banking relationship with use your banking services? There are a number of different red flags that we can identify. The other thing is to really ensure that compliance professionals have the tools and the training that they need to ultimately investigate these types of cases. And many of them involve cryptocurrency. So right now, I think there's a cadre of compliance professionals globally that have kind of deep expertise. How do we follow the money when it comes to crypto? I think we need more and more of that on compliance teams, not just from crypto firms, right? These are not just the crypto exchanges that are vulnerable to this, but from traditional financial institutions.
And also, it's like so big amounts we're talking about now as well. It's crazy.
Huge amounts. But then look, when you're talking about money laundering as a service, you're also talking about the red flags for the different actors that are involved, right? FinCEN has put out some really good red flags over the last couple of years on cartels.
Oh, which do you want to share some of the highlights involving red flags?
Sure. Yeah. I think obviously location comes into this. They recently did a geolocation order from FinCEN on Mexican drug cartels. Bulk cash is like the ultimate red flag when it comes to money laundering. It's something to really take a look at. Is this person or entity a known entity? Is it someone who's used your banking services before? There's all kinds of different things to ultimately look at. I think this is almost like, I haven't thought about it this way before, so I'll just I'll say it. But I think what you do is you compile red flags for pig butchering scams, which FinCEN has put out, for cartel activity that FinCEN has put out, for North Korea advisories that FinCEN has put out. Really start to understand, hey, these are all the things that we should be looking for.
I can imagine that maybe not only drug cartels are the users of these shadow banking. I can imagine now with all of the sanctions that are being implemented too, that sanctioned individuals and sanctioned businesses might be a customer of these shadow banking systems, and kind of putting a mockery to all of the sanctions implementation work that people are doing. Or what's your take on that?
Absolutely. I don't know that I'd go as far as mockery. I think that sanctions are very effective, but I think that we see globally threat actors looking to evade them at scale. And we're seeing something very interesting happen that I don't think we've ever seen happen before. And that is our adversaries, or at least those who are trying to evade US and UK and EU sanctions, are getting together.
Oh, really?
We see Chinese companies manufacturing military equipment, think drone, optical tech, selling it to Russia for use on the battlefield in Ukraine. We've seen at TRM, we've put out these reports that crypto has been used to pay for these sanctioned transactions. The ultimate example, and this is less of a sanctions example, but we see North Korea soldiers fighting alongside Russians on the battlefield in Ukraine. That is crazy, right? We see Russia and Iran talking about a gold-backed stablecoin for international payment between them, right? So I think that the reality is we're seeing adversaries who are looking to evade sanctions work together and leveraging these types of networks.
And how far up on the kind of to-do list of Trump and the US government is combating this issue? Because, it does sound like a serious threat.
Yeah, I would say that, we at TRM, my colleague Nick Carlson is probably the foremost expert in the world on this topic. He was an analyst at the FBI focused on North Korea and has followed the North Korea money laundering from the very beginning, way before crypto, to include, counterfeit cigarettes and $100 bills, the Bank of Bangladesh, Sony Pictures, the UK health system.
It's actually crazy how big counterfeit cigarettes are. It was a story in Norway the other day where it was like, someone had built kind of a fake, parts for a house, and it was just filled with cigarettes. And I'm like, man, it was like cigarettes for like $5 million or something crazy in one truck. I was like, wow. Rarely I hear about it.
Yeah, I would encourage folks that there's a really great case from a couple of years ago with British Tobacco involved in North Korea related money laundering. Obviously, and a settlement involved there with the U.S. Department of Justice. So it's at scale, and I think it's actually an important point because we have talked a little bit about North Korea today. North Korea is a criminal state and will do anything to evade sanctions and to launder funds. So they've now found this ability to utilize Chinese money laundering organizations, counterfeit cigarettes, these super bills, $100 bills. They tried to steal $1 billion from the Bank of Bangladesh, got far less, but still used, Chinese casinos in Macau and elsewhere to launder that cash. What's happening today is not new. It's just happening faster because of the use of crypto for cross-border transactions. And this existence of this shadow banking network has really been supercharged by the ability to move crypto, because you can move it outside of the traditional banking system. So it's really a perfect tool. I didn't answer your question, which was a really good one. And where is the current administration on this? I mentioned Nick because he and I and others at TRM have briefed really the highest levels of the US government on this topic. And I could say there's a lot of interest and a lot of focus, particularly because concerns around China are a focus, because concerns around cartels are a huge focus for this administration, right? I think on day one, President Trump, in his inaugural address, announced and then signed a designation of Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, which allows the U.S. Department of Defense and U.S. Department of Justice and others to use new tools to go after them. And I say all this to say that like part of disrupting cartels, which is like a number one priority for this administration, is disrupting the money laundering organizations that they're leveraging to launder funds.
We are almost at time here. So, but
how is that possible? That can't be possible. We've moved so fast here. This has been a great conversation. Wow.
I wanted to ask you, when you kind of look into the future, and what do you think are the real ways to kind of combat this industry? Is it even possible? What would stop it?
I think it's a whole of industry and government approach. And I think that's what's sort of missed a lot of times. You know, I talk a lot about cryptocurrency tracing tools like TRM. This is not something that we're going to trace our way out of. It's really important that law enforcement be able to track and trace the flow of funds on blockchains, because a lot of these transactions are happening in crypto. But funds move off chain, right, to these brokers and these shadow networks. We need to be able to have police work globally going after them. But then we need to use national security tools. We've used sanctions in the US to go after some of these types of organizations, particularly these scam networks that I mentioned, the pig butchering networks. You know, when I was a prosecutor, I worked with an amazing team, Zia Faruqi, who's now a federal judge in DC, Nick Carlson, who I mentioned, and several others, were the first team to use a Patriot Act subpoena on a Chinese bank. Basically, that required that the Chinese bank comply by providing records in a case involving North Korea money laundering. Well, you ask, why would a Chinese bank ever comply with U.S. legal process? The penalty for not complying is to cut off their correspondent banking to the U.S. That's a death penalty for a foreign bank. Can we use those types of authorities? We have them. You know, can we use those types of authorities to ensure that Chinese banks are not involved with this type of activity? And I think diplomacy is actually really key here. Can we work with China on trade or other issues that are top of mind for both countries right now to get China to step in and regulate some of this type of activity? Maybe, maybe not. But like, are there ways, right? Like, I don't know, you know, people look at me like I'm crazy when I say like, hey, can we find areas of agreement here with China, you know, where the Chinese would feel good about going after organized crime, by going after networks, by going after shadow banking? And I think the answer is probably yes, but I think we have to work towards finding areas of agreement here.
Yeah, now I just started thinking about like an episode that we might have to do is like, oh, is diplomacy the way to stop money laundering for goods? But
I would say honestly, like there's no silver bullet here, but we have to use every tool in our toolbox. Diplomacy is certainly one of those. Using, you know, law enforcement investigation, tracing crypto, using authorities under the Patriot Act. There are others, right? You know, are there ways to leverage offensive cyber in this situation? And that could be a whole other episode. But I guess we've said this could be a whole other episode so many times that just to make a final point is this issue, shadow banking, particularly these Chinese money laundering organizations, touches almost everything else that we talk about as compliance professionals, as law enforcement, as regulators, right? All of the major bad actors are using these types of organizations to launder illicit proceeds.
All right. Before we end this episode, we are going to dish out some quick fire questions for you. I'll say something. You say the first thing that comes to mind. The shorter, the better. All right. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Who benefits the most from shadow banking?
Cartels.
Who is their ideal customer profile?
Chinese national.
Yeah. What's the one thing compliance professionals should keep in mind when they are investigating shadow banking?
Always look for red flags, large amounts of funds, new customer.
Why does shadow banking matter in the real world?
Because the laundering of funds just isn't about moving money around. It's about the activity that's happening behind it. The North Korea hacks stealing billions of dollars, people losing their life savings, cartels moving drugs all over the world.
I agree. That brings the spin of the laundry to an end. Ari, thank you so much for joining me. If people want to connect with you after hearing the episode, where can they find you?
I am all over LinkedIn, a little bit less on X, and just find us at trmlabs.com. And tune into TRM Talks.
We'll definitely recommend that. Thank you to everyone who was listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, check out the back catalog of more than 130 episodes, and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. Please share the podcast on your social media channel, tell a colleague to subscribe, maybe give us a 5-star rating. It really helps people to find us. Got something interesting you want to share with us? Comment on the Strise LinkedIn, my LinkedIn, or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, our producer was Matthew, and our editor was Dominic. See you next time. Do you believe that crypto still has some legitimate use after working in this field, or do you just see like criminal activity all over? Like, this is off the record. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, your AML automation software for faster onboarding, smarter monitoring, and growth without overhead.